Okay, this is TEAS Science Mock version 5. A quick note up front, and I've said this in the other science mocks as well, so this is kind of something that always applies. There are some questions that I do in the mocks that are a bit harder than the way that they would be asked on the real test. So I always say that the science mocks, or all of the mocks rather, are very, very accurate to the test, and they very much are. So if you can answer the questions in my mocks, and if you can, understand the passages in my mocks, you are 100% going to answer the questions on the test. What I mean when I say that mine are a little bit harder is you're going to see instances, you have seen instances because you've already taken this test, where there's 2 or 3, maybe even 4 blanks in one question. There's not much of that on the test. It does come up here and there where they'll say, insulin is released from blank cells and does blank with blood sugar or something like that. But there are more of those in my mocks than there are on the real test to allow you to be completing these advanced thought processes. So I will point them out when I notice them and remember to do so. But there are definitely a lot more scenarios in my mock, especially this one and mock 6, that are causing you to use a little bit more of your thought process from your class than maybe what you would have to use on the real test. So there's a tiny bit of leeway between what you score on this and what you would score on the real science test. I would give yourself back a couple of points knowing if there's 2 or 3 blanks on a question and you miss it, you probably missed it because of the technicality of having that many blanks that you're trying to manage, more so than not knowing all of the content that's in those blanks. And you can be the judge of that because you'll know what your rationale was when you were answering those questions. I will do my best to point those out as we run into them. I also have some instances where I have answer choices that are closer together, harder to discern between than what they would really be on the test. So it's aimed at over-preparing you a bit. This is still very, very accurate to the test, but versions 5, 6, and 7 are aimed at being actually a little bit more aggressive and a little bit harder, because a lot of you are on secondary plans if you're doing this version, and this is aimed at making sure you're really doing these full thought processes and thinking this through, and that you actually know these off the top of your head. With science, there should be an instant recall, and you've heard this probably in the other mocks before. When you read a question in science, there should be something that pops into your head right away. You should have an instant recall where you picture the thing that you need to picture. You see the word that needs to come to your mouth to answer the question. So pay particular attention to that. What I'm basically saying when I say that is you shouldn't really need the answer choices in order to figure out what it's asking you. So you're still at a level that's less than the proficiency that you need if you need to see the answer choices to know what the question means. That said, obviously the answer choices on this exam are very advanced. So I'm not saying that you're supposed to be able to recite an answer choice that's as long as this one right here, just off the top of your head. Nothing like that. Just that you know where they're headed and what the question is centering on right when you read the question. Always read every answer choice for sure. A lot of times there's going to be a couple of them that are very close together. But pay particular attention as you're mock testing, especially these last few. Pay particular attention to how much is popping into my head just as I'm reading the question. I'm going to follow along on a paper version where I made some notes to make sure that I get a chance to mention to you anything that will be helpful as far as, this is a little different than the test because of this or that. I will note anywhere that I remember to point out if something is a little harder or a little different than how it would look on the test. And then ultimately when we finish this, make sure you let me know what was your score, how was your instant recall, that sort of thing. I will label on the left what class something is from. If I put a 2, like I'm going to do on this first question, it's anatomy. The only ones that I'm going to put letters are going to be the ones that are not anatomy. So like question 1 is anatomy 2, question 2 is anatomy 2, question 3 is anatomy 4, to give you a few examples. So the ones that have numbers are anatomy. If something is from life science, as number 5 is, I'm going to say life science 2 like that. That just saves me some space and some time. And I will try to get these answers out as quickly as possible and only explain the things that I need to so that you can grade it as quickly as possible. Number 1 is one of the new circulating questions that a lot of people have had questions on. What is a distinguishing factor between endocrine and exocrine glands? The distinguishing factor between those two, exocrine, as the name implies, is something that leaves the body, and it has to have a duct in order to do that. So that is, there's not variations on how that one gets answered. That is how that one gets answered. What is cephalization? Also a new one that I've gotten questions on. That one is A, the process of localizing sensory organs. Number 3, which of the following organs may shrink with age? So this is a bigger thought process that I want to make sure you know about. Your immune system grows as you are a child. So as you mature, when you go from, young child to older child to young adult, your immune system is expanding and it's growing. Then it plateaus and it stays the same. It becomes stagnant throughout the time that you are an adult. And then it eventually decreases in its activity. It eventually kind of shrinks. And so not only does this gland, which is the thymus, which is one of the immune glands, not only does it decrease in size, just your immune system as a whole decreases in its function. So you're no longer making tons and tons and tons of T cells, and you're no longer maturing tons and tons of cells, and your thymus shrinks because it does not have as much use. That's why the elderly are so much more susceptible to the flu and pneumonia and all of that. So I just wanted to make sure you have a bit more background on that and why that would be the case. The thymus looks like an endocrine gland because of the way that it's named, or a lot of people have said that to me. But that is the only one that's listed here that is an immune system organ. The thymus is part of the immune system. 4, starch is broken down in the digestive system by which of the following? I get questions on this a lot, so I included it here so that I can point this out. Starch is another way of saying carbohydrates. When I teach this in class, I say carbohydrates. So that would be the same answer that you would say if you talked about carbs, which is amylase. 5, which of the following describes the role of DNA and RNA in mitosis? This is very similar to a current question, and it's very similar in how I have it answered. And that's going to be A. This is not really a question. Even when I see this question, I don't answer it because the answer stands out as such a wonderful answer. I answer it because the other answers are definitely not true and definitely not correct, if that makes sense. So like DNA does not aid in synthesis of a nucleus. DNA does not make a nucleus. That's definitely not something that we learn about. RNA does not get replicated, so we definitely don't have that. And DNA does not copy RNA. So the answer to this question on the real test really is something very much like this. The problem with this answer is we think of this backwards from how it's written here. We think of DNA and RNA completing mitosis in order to synthesize proteins, but you arguably can use the language in both ways. DNA and RNA ultimately participate in a protein production process, which ultimately at the end of its next life cycle would aid in the next cycle of mitosis. So technically speaking, that is true. And if you see the same question that I've seen several times, your other answers will give away that that is how it's going to be answered. That's from Life Science 2. Number 6, what is the function of the nuclear pore, is from Life Science 1, which is about the parts of the cell. The nuclear pore is like when you look at the nucleus, the pictures of the nucleus, it has those little tiny dots all over it. They're little bitty holes on the outside of the nucleus. The purpose of that is that that's how RNA travels in and out of the nucleus. RNA enters the nucleus so that it can transcribe DNA, and then it goes back out of the nucleus so that it can go to the cytoplasm and use that code to help synthesize proteins. So anytime you see nuclear pore, you're looking for RNA uses that to travel through. You just want to make sure that the rest of the language in the question is also correct. So you want to make sure they don't say something wacky like it goes in there and then DNA leaves, or it goes in there and it makes a protein in the nucleus, or something crazy like that. You want to make sure it says RNA goes through there and it transcribes DNA, or it just says RNA travels in and out of the nucleus using that, or something like that. All of the others that you see on this one are a little crazy. So the nuclear pore does not replicate DNA. If you tried to speak very, very generally, you could get confused there and say that that's true, but the nuclear pore is just a hole. So it does not replicate DNA. It just operates as a channel that RNA can go through when it's replicating DNA. 7, gas exchange in the alveoli occurs by what biological process? I would say that this is from Anatomy 4, but it's also from Anatomy 3, and arguably it's also slightly from Life Science 2. So this one spans several areas that we've talked about. Gas exchange in the alveoli occurs by what biological process? We definitely talked about this in Anatomy 4 as the primary location. Gas exchange happens by diffusion. I will point out this is a little trickier than what they do on the test. I actually used gas exchange as one of the answers. Notice that the question says gas exchange occurs by what process? You cannot say gas exchange occurs by gas exchange, right? So that wouldn't be providing them any information at all. They are not quite that tricky on the TEAS. So you don't need to worry that they're going to actually do that. I just did that to make sure that as you're getting very close to testing, because you're seeing one of these last editions, that you're paying attention to wordings and you're paying attention to the fact that they're asking you for a very specific process name rather than just a generic term. So gas exchange is a very generic term. We're wanting the biological term. That's why they said biological process, and that's going to be diffusion. Really, I can't think of an instance on the TEAS where we would use osmosis. Osmosis is very specific. It has a very specific definition. I can't think of a question that's currently on the TEAS where we use it. The carrier-mediated transport, you would only use that in a situation that relates to aquaporins or protein channels. It would have to very specifically be talking about something like that. And active transport would be another one that they could put here. You will not use that. So active transport, not on there. Osmosis, not on there. Carrier transport would be very much a biology question, not an anatomy question. Anything you see that is about anatomy will be diffusion. And we've talked about this in several instances in several classes. We've talked about blood exchanging oxygen, CO2, pretty much anything that the blood carries, everything gets on and off of those red blood cells using diffusion. We've talked about the kidneys and filtering the blood at the site of the kidneys. We've talked about that being diffusion. I think there's another question coming up on this mock, if I'm not mistaken, that asks another thing about this. So if it has to do with anatomy and exchanges happening with the blood in some way, it will be diffusion. Number 8, which of the following organelles is used for intracellular digestion? Intracellular digestion or cellular waste consumption is lysosomes. That's Life Science 1. Be very careful because there's also something called lysozymes. Zyme is an enzyme. An enzyme is not a cellular part. It's an enzyme, which is a much, much bigger thing than a cell. So lysosomes are responsible for intracellular digestion. That's just like the nucleus, the mitochondria, the ER network. You are supposed to know what each part of a eukaryotic cell is for, what each part of it does. Vacuoles are for storage. That's the only thing you might have gotten confused between, is what is a vacuole and what is a lysosome. Lysosomes are for waste. They get rid of waste. And vacuoles are for storage. Enzymes are molecules, and they're way bigger than cells. So you would not find an enzyme in that context. 9, what is the function of a neuron? This is a very specific thing we've discussed extensively in Anatomy 2. When we talk about the function of a neuron, we need to make sure that we don't specify half of the nervous system. We talk very, very extensively about not ending up answering this question, because this is saying if you pick any neuron at random in the body, absolutely any random neuron in the body, we need a definition that goes with any random neuron. So it can't say sensory and it can't say motor, because then that's a very specific neuron and it would have had to have specified that. So in this case, our answer is B. There's a few possible wordings that are okay. So we could say transmits messages, transmits signals, transmits action potentials. There's a lot of ways that we can say it. We can say creates action potentials or electrical signals. All of that's good. So there's lots of ways these answers can look. But it can't say sensory and it can't say motor, because if it says one of those two, we're now just saying what half of them do, not what all of them do anymore. So in this case, it's going to be creates action potentials. I personally don't think I've ever taken the TEAS and not been asked that question. The answers are always different. There must be 15 variations of possible answer sets. They're always like this. There's always one that's transmits signals or messages, but it's got like sensory in it. There's one that's carries something and it's got motor. And there's one that's action potentials and it may or may not have sensory in it or motor. And there's one of them in there somewhere that doesn't have one of those. And that's always going to be your answer. 10 is a little more complicated than what you're usually going to see on the test. This comes out of Anatomy 1. So this is a lot of blanks. This is to make sure that you are studying the integumentary system in the manner that we discussed in Anatomy 1, because it's pretty tricky. So you should be thinking about two things when you're thinking about the material that we discussed in Anatomy 1. You should be thinking about prevalence and you should be thinking about uniqueness. So uniqueness is when you look at a particular layer of the epidermis, and remember this is talking about stratum layers. So we're not talking about the layers of the skin as a whole, we're talking about layers of the epidermis. When we talk about these stratum layers, if we look at any given stratum layer, we could find certain cell types that are unique within that layer that we wouldn't find in other layers. And we can find things that are more prevalent there than they might be somewhere else. This question is much more complex as far as filling in all these blanks than what you would see on the test. This is to make sure that you are thinking of all of that and you're prepared for all of that. This first part, be very careful because it says the first blank are cells that are found exclusively in the stratum basal. So, for example, C, melanin is found exclusively in that layer, but melanin is not a cell, so that is a trick question. So in order to be a cell, it's got to be one of these three. So blank are cells found exclusively. Keratinocytes are not exclusive to the basal. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Keratinocytes are in all of the layers. So we would take C out because melanin is not a cell, and we would take B out because keratinocytes are not unique. Stem cells and melanocytes both are unique. So those two can stay in place. And then we have two different ones that are the most prevalent cell types in this layer. Melanocytes, if we're looking at D, they are not very prevalent. They are unique to this layer, but they are not that prevalent. The two that are prevalent are stem cells and keratinocytes. That's a lot of information to know. That's a lot of very specific things that you're supposed to know. So make sure you don't necessarily need to have gotten all of that nailed down all at once with all these blanks, and you had to notice that that said cells and it couldn't have been melanin. If you didn't get that right, I'm not worried about that. Just make sure you did study prevalence and uniqueness and that you pay attention to those weird, silly little things like cells, and that's the thought process that you're using. 11 comes from scientific reasoning to lab equipment. And this is reading a triple beam balance. It looks a lot harder than it is. These can be in the weirdest order. When you read a triple beam balance, there's three parts. There's something that's in the hundreds, and it could be at the bottom. It could be in the weirdest place. There's something in the hundreds, there's something in the tens, and there's something in the ones. And you're going to put them together exactly that way. So in this case, it's 142. If these had been in a totally different order, you'd still do it that way. So you could have had the 100 down here, the 40 here, and the 2 there, and you would have said 142. So that's 142 grams. That question is circulating a whole lot now. All you do is you start with your biggest number and you say it to yourself. So 142. You find the order that they go in and you say them to yourself. If you try to write them, it's weird because it's like this. And you can write them, but then say them to yourself. And you'll hear it. You'll hear what the number is. 142. 12, during inhalation, the thoracic cavity blank due to the blank of the blank muscles. Again, more blanks than you're typically going to see. This is from Anatomy 4 about the respiratory system. This is going to be the thoracic cavity expands, and that's due to contraction of the diaphragm. What's important about this, diaphragm is going to be who causes inhalation. We talked extensively about this in previous mocks that you've already seen and also in your Anatomy 4. The diaphragm causes inhalation and exhalation. The intercostal muscles by themselves cannot cause the whole chest cavity to do something. Intercostal muscles combined with diaphragm, yes, absolutely, but not by themselves. So C and D should have gotten crossed out right away. With the expand and collapse, do the breath. Every time that you get this question on the test, take a breath and say, did I just expand my chest or did I just decrease the size of my chest cavity? Actually do it so that you know for sure what's happening. If you expand your chest, you contract your diaphragm. Number 13, what would be the most likely result of damage to the alveoli? Also from 4, Anatomy 4. You want to, anytime that you get something like this, there's lots of questions that are about something getting damaged or something disappears from somewhere or something like that. You need to think very specifically about what that thing does, and don't think about the big picture of what it does. Think about the little specific thing it does. The alveoli does gas exchange. So blood comes to the alveoli, and specifically O2 and CO2 change places, right? So what is gas exchange? Think about what gas exchange is. So the blood comes in to the alveoli, right? Blood comes into the alveoli, drops off CO2 into the alveoli, and picks up O2 from the alveoli. So at the time that this happens, your alveoli, you breathe in and your alveoli obtain and hold oxygen from your environment. The blood comes through there. Your alveoli are holding oxygen, waiting for that blood to come and get it. The blood comes through. The alveoli gives that oxygen to that blood, and in turn takes some CO2 from that blood and sends that out and repeats that cycle. So what happens if you have damage to the alveoli is oxygen will not be absorbed into the blood. If your alveoli get damaged, they won't absorb oxygen when you breathe. If they don't absorb oxygen when you breathe, your blood won't absorb it. When you look at all the other answers, they should look ridiculous if you think of it in this specific way. It's very easy to try to think too big. Think very specifically, and all the others sound crazy. So if you look at A, blood will not be returned to the heart. Blood moving about the body has nothing to do with alveoli. It'll move just the same. That's the heart that does that. Blood will not be carried from the heart to the lungs. Your heart has no clue what your alveoli are or are not doing. So the heart's still going to send the blood out to the lungs because it doesn't know that's going on. So nothing is going to affect the movement of the blood. That's going to go on as normal. What's very specifically going to happen is the gas exchange is not going to happen. So you're still going through the motions. You just don't actually end up with gas exchange. And the answer choice that says that is C. D is wrong because it says CO2 will not be absorbed into the blood. Very nitpicky. They would not give you an answer choice this hard. That's just me. CO2 will not be absorbed into the blood in the lungs. That's backwards. CO2 would need to go into the alveoli out of the blood. So the word into is what's wrong with D. If you had D or C, you nailed it. You're fine. If you had A or B, you're trying to think way too big picture. You're not picturing the function of the alveoli. If you had D, hopefully the word into is now standing out to you and you see that. But if you had either of those second two, you got the point that I was trying to make. 14 is from Life Science 1, organelle responsible for transport of protein. In this case, it's endoplasmic reticulum because they didn't specify smooth or rough or anything more specific than endoplasmic reticulum. 15, Life Science 1 also. The blank is a series of folded membranes belonging to the protein network. In this case, it's going to be rough endoplasmic reticulum. Both of these two were general. They gave you a general description on number 15 and then a specific name. Opposite with number 14, they gave you a specific function, but a general name. You need to be prepared for both. So sometimes they're going to specify transport, like they did here, or synthesizing of proteins, and sometimes they're not. And if they give you a specific function and a specific name, you need to pair those specifically. So had they had smooth available here, you would have needed to specify that. If they had had endoplasmic reticulum here, and they wouldn't have put them both there if it was specific, that would have very much answered that question, because it didn't say anything about what it did. It just said it's a series of membranes. It's part of the protein network. So they don't necessarily have to pair them in the most logical way. 16, which of the following organelles do all cells contain? This is also Life Science 1 about cells. This is harder than the real test. You probably know from my previous mocks, it's only going to be one. So I've never seen this question with 2 answers where you had to get 2 of them right. I did this because I want to make sure you know as many of them as possible. There are 4 of these that are possible. So the 2 that are correct is the ones in B, a cell membrane and genetic information. If you answered C, DNA is too specific. They do not every cell in the entire universe has DNA. Every cell in the entire universe has some type of genetic information. The 4 things are ribosomes, cytoplasm, some type of genetic material, and a cell membrane, which can also be called a plasma membrane. You should know those 4. They won't have you answer 2 of them at once like I did, but they will potentially have you choose any of those 4. The scientific term for the likely outcome of an experiment is the hypothesis. That's from Science Reasoning 1. This is not the most common definition they use for it. That's why I put it on this particular mock. Usually they say something like a prediction instead of saying likely outcome, but they could say likely outcome as well. A scientist wishes to test for a possible relationship between cancer cells and viruses. Which of the following steps should be taken first? That should be A, and it's always going to be like this: research of some kind to find information or previous research done on this topic. That is Science Reasoning 1. 19, multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease resulting from the breakdown of nervous tissue. That's from Anatomy 2, but also Anatomy 1, because autoimmune is discussed in Anatomy 1. Number 20, blank would lower blood calcium levels by stimulating osteoblasts to build new bone. If you took my new intense review anatomy class, you probably have these blood calcium hormones nailed down. If you didn't, and you're still having trouble with these, I really explain that in the new intense review. You want to make sure that you very specifically know what each one of these does and that you're thinking about it in these terms right here. There's 2 hormones that are responsible for lowering. No, there's 2 hormones that are responsible for raising blood calcium, and there's 1 hormone responsible for lowering it. And if you can just nail that down, you're 90% of the way. The one that would lower blood calcium is calcitonin. And the way you can tell that calcitonin is the answer on question 20 is they have 2 answers there that would both be the same basic thing. So it's hard to ever answer calcitrol without answering parathyroid hormone. They're almost the same exact thing. So if you see both of them together, then you know it's the other one that doesn't go with those 2. 21 is the opposite. So raising blood calcium is going to be calcitrol and or PTH, which is why they don't have PTH there. Both of those are from Anatomy 2, and Intense Review, of course, has the best for all of the endocrine stuff, the best possible version of the endocrine stuff, is in the intense anatomy review. 22, what is a hormone that stimulates the testes in the male reproductive system, is from Anatomy 3. 22 and 23 go together. This is very nitpicky. This is not what the test would do. This is much harder than the test, and I put them back to back on purpose to show you a thought process. The hormone that stimulates the testes, that stimulates a gamete. So a gamete is stimulated by FSH. When a gamete is stimulated, it promotes production of a germ cell. That's a very careful distinction. So when a gamete has been stimulated, that gamete promotes the germ cell being produced. So these two questions go back to back because to stimulate a gamete, that's what FSH does. This is coming from the pituitary, and it stimulates the actual gamete. When the gamete is stimulated, then the germ cell is promoted by said gamete. So 23 would be promoting sperm production. That's the germ cell specifically. The reason it's not D is this is the secondary. Hunger responses is not the primary purpose. And then the reason it's not stimulates the testes is because of the above question. FSH would be who did that. So understand the distinction between A and B. They're not going to ask you a question that nitpicky, but if you understand what that fundamental difference is, you are in very, very good shape. 24 is from Anatomy 3 also. During ovulation, the corpus luteum forms. The primary, again, primary purpose is, hopefully you know right away that you look for releasing progesterone, and then you can narrow that down so that you can thicken the endometrium, or in some way ready the uterus for pregnancy. That's what you're ultimately looking for. Not increase the odds of fertilization. That's not something that happens with progesterone. 25, ligaments are an example of connective tissue. That's from Anatomy 1. 26, a doctor at the urgent care clinic tells a patient he pulled a muscle in his back, which could be the muscle. It could be A. These two are in the neck. This is in the chest. You don't need to know neck or chest muscles. You just need to know the lats. That is the only one that I've ever seen them ask for specifically on the TEAS. If you're doing the HESI, that's a whole different story. If you're just doing the TEAS, that's the only muscle you need to be able to identify. 27 says eccrine glands release what and are located in what relationship to the sebaceous. That's from Anatomy 1. Eccrine release sweat. They are located deep to the sebaceous glands. So that would be B. Sebaceous glands are located on hair follicles. So they are superficial in comparison to sweat glands. 28 is from Anatomy 1. Also, veins and arteries in the skin are located in what layer? They are in the hypodermis. The dermis has arterioles and venules as well as capillaries. The capillaries are almost up against the epidermis, but not quite. So there is no blood vessels actually in the epidermis. The epidermis is epithelial tissue, which does not get blood supplied directly, but almost. It's almost up in there. And then the hypodermis has fat, which can house the actual blood vessels, which are the veins and the arteries. 29, red blood cells are manufactured in the red bone marrow, which is from Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 4. Osteoporosis can be marked by a decrease in and an increase in. This is from Anatomy 1. There are multiple possible scenarios. Guaranteed, you cannot have osteoporosis without a decrease in blasts. So the decrease, you definitely have to have a decrease in blasts. That would cause a decrease in sites automatically. So if that's available, we want to put it there. The increase in clasts may or may not happen, but again, if it's there, that is a possible scenario that we have with osteoporosis. So the can be is because there's different ways that it presents. The only one that's accurate that's here is A. All of the other ones have something that you know can't happen with osteoporosis. So they're not asking you to identify what it looks like. You can't identify what it looks like. There's multiple possibilities. They're just showing you different scenarios that are impossible. It's not possible for sites to increase. It's not possible for blasts to increase. And again, not possible for blasts to increase. The only possibility is A. 31, what landmark would be found at the top of the femur? And then they clarify and say at the end of the femur closest to the hip. That is the proximal epiphysis. So when it relates it to the hip, that's the joint that it is proximal to. So the proximal epiphysis is closer to the attachment, and then epiphysis is on the end of a bone, whereas diaphysis would be in the center of the bone. That is from Anatomy 1. A young woman comes into the ER with a broken tibia. What steps in order will her bones take to repair the damage? So hematoma is always first. That will allow you to see right away that it's either A or D. Remodeling is always going to be last. And then it's fibrous followed by bony. So that will be A. That's from Anatomy 1 as well. Which of the following is an example of a hinge joint? Also from Anatomy 1. That's going to be jaw, and the other two possibilities are knee and elbow. I almost always see jaw for that one. Sensory neurons in the brain are responsible for. The key on this one, this is from Anatomy 2, is sensory, not brain, because sensory neurons are very specific. The brain is a location, but sensory trumps brain as far as what's important here. Sensory neurons are incoming information. The brain is a control center, so we have integration and control in the brain, but sensory neurons, as well as being located throughout the body, they are also located in the brain, and they are responsible for incoming information. If this had just said the brain, then you would use integration and control. The difference between C and D is that D is a better answer if we didn't say sensory neurons and we instead said the brain. If it says sensory neurons, even if they're in the brain, don't do integration and control. They do sensory. Again, that's pretty picky. That's pickier than what you're going to see. 35, which of the following is a protein that can be released in response to stress? Again, pretty picky. A lot of these questions are a bit harder. These aren't ridiculous, but they are a little harder than what you would really see because this is edition 5 of the mock. A protein, you got to remember that hormones are proteins. So that's another way of saying an endocrine hormone. In response to stress, I'm talking about fight or flight. And we don't usually use the word stress, but the reason that I put this on here is that is a new question addition that's somewhat like this on the test, that they use the word stress because we're used to fear, excitement, fight or flight. They don't usually use the word stress by itself. It's usually accompanied by fear or excitement. The protein thing, I added that in to make it harder than it was. So they did say hormone or something like that. Chemical, I think actually was the word that they used in response to stress. So keep in mind that they could rephrase a bit, and you need to not only know what the words are that you're supposed to know, but have a visual image of what would be happening so that if they use a weird word, you do recognize it, even though you didn't memorize it that way. 36 is from Anatomy 2 as well. Which of the following are two divisions of the nervous system? I put this one in here to make sure that you get review about something. There are 3 possible things that are going on in these answer choices. There are sensory and motor divisions, and that's an easy one to forget about. Another way of saying sensory and motor divisions is afferent and efferent divisions. That is literally the same thing as saying sensory and motor. That's just like saying epinephrine, norepinephrine versus adrenaline, noradrenaline. They're just two names for the same pair of things. Then there is central and peripheral. That does not mean the same thing, which is why I put a box around the top two and not this one. Central versus peripheral refers to location. Sensory and motor refers to the type of signals. Those are all ways that we can divide up the nervous system. There's also the whole sympathetic versus parasympathetic and all that. Those are smaller divisions. So anytime we get this question, we're looking for pairs that make sense as pairs. The pair that makes sense in this case, and again, this question's a little bit harder than the real questions, but not much, is going to be A. Motor is another way of saying efferent. So choice A is like saying afferent, efferent, or it's like saying motor and sensory. B has motor and efferent together. I did this to try to make sure you remember which one is which and that you identified that that's repeating itself. Sensory and central cannot be paired. Central refers to brain and spinal cord. Sensory refers to sensory. They are not two halves of a whole. Central and sympathetic are two different levels of organization. So the only one that has two appropriate halves to a whole is A. They definitely do that whole mispairing, misnaming thing. I haven't seen them do it with efferent and motor, or afferent and motor, but they definitely do the misnaming thing. You want to be prepared for that on every level, and you want to make sure you know that motor, sensory, afferent, efferent, all of that is fair game for them to use for divisions. Which of the following hormones is active as part of the parasympathetic nervous system? This is from Anatomy 2/3, you would say, and that's going to be amylase. This is still a question that I tend to get asked about. It's been talked about for a long time. When the parasympathetic is active, it's rest and digest. So this is not the same thing as saying sympathetic is active and adrenaline is being released. But when parasympathetic is active, the digestive system is active. Amylase is part of the digestive system. So that's not the same thing, but it certainly would be active at the same time, which is what they're asking you for. 38, muscle tissue can be identified by which two traits is from Anatomy 2. Again, they're usually going to have you identify one trait. Typically, the one trait is the excess of mitochondria. That's typically what they ask about. The other thing I wanted to make sure that you know and remember is the excess heat production. That's the result of the excess mitochondria. Those go hand in hand. The second part of that is not something you're probably going to be directly asked, but it's a really good thing to know for bigger context on bigger questions. 39, a sarcomere is made up of myosin and actin. Actin makes up the blank filaments and is responsible for blank. That's going to be from Anatomy 2. And it is the thin filaments responsible for support. Sarcomeres with myosin and actin is one of the areas that you do tend to see 2 or 3 blanks in one question. 40, also an area we tend to see multiple blanks, and this is from Anatomy 2 and 3, discussed with endocrine as well as digestive. So insulin is released from beta and it lowers blood sugar, and then glucagon is released from alpha and it raises blood sugar. So that is A. 41 is a very important question to make sure you have understanding of all of this. So again, here's these words, afferent, efferent. And then we have the words arterial and venule. So this is asking the blank carries oxygenated toxic blood into the nephron. And then the blank carries purified oxygenated blood out of the nephron. So we have a lot going on. The nephron is where blood would get purified. And you notice one of these blanks says toxic blood, another says purified. So somewhere in the midst of this, the blood got purified, probably because we went into the nephron and out of the nephron. So that changed. What didn't change here is our oxygenation. It said oxygenated there, and it said it again there. So we started out oxygenated and toxic. We came out oxygenated and pure. The word afferent means the first part of something. It means before. The word efferent means after. So we apply that in the nervous system because afferent means the sensory part that happens before, and then efferent means the motor part that happens after the sensory part. So these have that same meaning. And then we also know that arterial and venule have a certain meaning. And arterial would be headed away from the heart. And if we're out in the body and we're headed away from the heart, we would have oxygen. A venule, again, if we're out in the body and we're not in the heart or near the heart, a venule would be deoxygenated. So if we're remaining oxygenated here, it would be fair to say we don't want venule to be in our answer, right? Because we're not deoxygenated. Both of these do say oxygenated. So what we're dealing with is arterial versus venule. We've got that figured out because we have not done gas exchange. We have not found a reason to change from an arterial to a venule. So we want arterial to be in both halves. Then we need to determine where do we want the word afferent and where do we want efferent. We can assume based on their word meanings that afferent is on the way into the nephron. It's the entrance at the beginning of the nephron, and efferent is on its way out of the nephron after the nephron. So we want afferent to be toxic, and we want efferent to be purified, and that's going to be B. I have not probably asked you a question quite like that before, and you probably won't see a question quite like that on the test. This is very, 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 very important, and this arterial venule is very important. There is definitely some questions about the afferent and efferent arterioles on the test. They don't come up as often as other questions, but they're definitely there, and it's very important to know the prefixes of af and eth, and it's very important to know how to determine if something would be arterial, venule, capillary, and so on at a given location in the body. So definitely, if it would be beneficial, play that little segment again. Make sure you're 100% absolutely confident on the explanation that I just did for that, and make sure that if it was a different context, different part of the body with similar information, that you'd be able to nail that down and fully understand that right when you saw it, because that is really valuable knowledge. 42 is from Anatomy 3. A blank is an example of a germ cell, while a blank is an example of a gamete. These don't have to be paired appropriately to gender. You could totally have a sperm cell here and an ovary here. That would be fine. However, the way that they happen to have these answers put together, the only one that works is A. All of the others are either, in the case of B, these are both germ cells. In the case of C and D, they are backwards. They've got the gamete first, and it's supposed to be the germ cell first. 43, what is the correct order of structures that a sperm cell passes through in the duct system? We know that the testes come first, so they've got that first in almost all of the answers, but we can eliminate D. We know that the urethra is last, and that actually narrows it all the way down to choice C. If it weren't narrowed down that far, the middle two are alphabetical. 44, protein digestion begins where and with what enzyme? In the stomach with protease. That is anatomy 3. 45, blank is characterized by loss of function in cilia and in turn chronic mucus production. And then blank is characterized by loss of structure in alveoli. This is from anatomy 4. This is very important. I hope that you caught that it must be chronic bronchitis. The definition of chronic bronchitis and bronchitis are vastly different. They're nothing like each other. Chronic bronchitis is loss of function in cilia. Bronchitis, like you and I would get, is inflammation of the bronchi caused by something very different, not loss of function in the cilia. So chronic bronchitis is caused by loss of cilia function, and then that in turn causes the chronic mucus production. Emphysema is what is caused by loss of structure to the alveoli, caving of the alveoli walls. So that is B. 46 is from anatomy 4 as well. Which of the following series of steps belongs to the pulmonary circuit? The correct answer is A. C is actually wrong. I'm going to let you figure out why. There is something actually wrong with C. Something is incorrect anatomically or physiologically about it. B is right, but it's systemic. And D is right, but it's systemic. I did that ahead of time because I knew that would take a very long time to do. 47, blood is filtered in the kidneys using a process of, hopefully this earlier discussion caused you to know exactly what that was. That should be diffusion, and that is from anatomy 3 with the kidneys. So I did definitely point out anywhere that I made the questions a little bit trickier than they should have been. Hopefully those thought processes worked. Anywhere that I stopped and explained why you would want a more advanced thought process, definitely go back to those if you think there's anything to gain or get a little bit better at. Mock Science 6 is designed the same way to be a little bit too hard to get some of those thought processes going. So if you're doing 5 and 6, you're doing them as part of a secondary program, you will find probably that by the time you get to the test, the thought processes you're having to use on the test are much simpler than what you're using here, and you're over prepared. And that is the goal of secondary, if secondary is what you're doing. If you're not doing secondary and you don't know what that means, if you've never heard secondary, then you're not doing secondary. Then in that case, you will be very much over prepared. The test is not quite this hard. Let me know if you have specific questions or things you did not understand my explanation for. Always go back to a class if you notice that I referenced a lecture that you don't remember hearing the thing that the question is about, because it's definitely impossible to absorb everything, even if you heard a lecture twice or 3 times. That's the whole benefit of the format that this is in, is you can go in and out of those as many times as you want. Definitely with anatomy, unless you're in a huge rush to get through all of your content, you can absolutely go back, hear them again, hear them again. The language is very, very specific. The things that you need to know about answer choices and how they qualify or disqualify, that's very important. So if you're not instantly recalling information that's answering all of these questions, or if you get lost when there's multiple pieces and you don't know how to recall all of that, definitely go back and get to those lectures again until you have that completely mastered and it's all second nature. So that is it for Mock Science 5. Let me know your score and how it went, and I will see you guys later.